Welcome to Take or Give, the podcast where we give you a backstage pass to the aid and international development sector and explain exactly how things really work beyond what you might see on TV or read about in the news headlines or on social media. I'm Lauriane, founder and director of the advocacy team.
And I'm Alex. I'm an independent researcher, advocate, and actor. And we're your co-hosts for this podcast.
Welcome to Series 1, where we will break down the aid and development sector by busting 3 key myths. We'll tell you about the myths, we'll explain why they are in fact false. And today we're introducing and debunking our third and final myth. It's the myth that the international development sector is woke.
So before we can address this myth of whether the international development sector is woke, firstly, we need to understand exactly what we mean by that word, woke.
And woke is a term that I hear often, maybe even every day. It's often thrown about as an insult, especially in some parts of the press. But the origins of the term are really in North America, and it's associated with people like the philosopher Marcus Garvey and the blues singer Lead Belly. At its root, it's an encouragement for people to be alert and alive to injustice, especially racial injustice.
I agree, Lauriane. Woke most definitely feels like an insult these days. But as it happens, not one that I think we can actually throw at the development sector. Because if the sector really were quote-unquote woke, we might expect it to have a core and ongoing focus on issues related to racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and other forms of discrimination.
In our experience, including as the co-founders of a social enterprise called the Equity Index, where we've looked into issues related to racial and gender equity in the sector, this is not entirely the case.
To get us started, we'd like to read you a statement and then ask you to guess where it comes from. So here it goes. Quote, "Racism manifests in the very structure of international aid. The sector still reflects the power relationships of colonialism. It shows up in the terminology that aid actors use to describe the people they work with and in fundraising campaigns which reinforce stereotypes of people in low and middle income countries as helpless and in need of savings." End quote.
So tell us, who do you think said this? And we're going to give you 4 options. Was it A, me, B, Alex, C, some other woke person, or D, the UK Parliament?
Well, it may surprise you to know, and it still surprises me, to be honest, that the correct answer is D. That was a direct quote from a parliamentary inquiry that looked into racism in the aid sector.
So back in 2001, a committee in Parliament, that's the International Development Committee, launched an inquiry into the philosophy and culture of aid. And as part of that inquiry, they had a dedicated focus on racism in the aid sector.
So Lauriane and many other experts gave evidence to the inquiry, and if you're interested, we highly recommend reading the full report. We'll link to it below. It's very interesting.
Absolutely. And as you would expect, the committee, having looked at all of the evidence, they made a number of recommendations for how to address racism in the aid sector. And the way that it normally works is that select committees have a role in scrutinizing a government department. And the main government department responsible for aid is now the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Sometimes you'll hear the acronym FCDO. So typically the International Development Committee is scrutinizing the FCDO and making recommendations for how it spends, how it runs its programs, etc. What was unusual about this inquiry is that it absolutely did that, and the committee made recommendations to the FCDO, but they also made recommendations to the broader aid and development sector. So they spoke to the entire sector as a whole. And the key things that they recommended that the sector should look at could be broken down into 4 main areas. One is, they said, they looked at how development organizations work with their partners and with organizations in the Global South. 2, they looked at how development organizations communicate and tell stories about international development. 3, they made recommendations about data and evidence about racism and diversity in international development. And they also made suggestions for how organizations can build a more equitable partnerships and a more equitable sector.
So let's return to the grounding myth of the episode that the development sector is woke. So if you read the guiding principles, stated values, often strategies of many development organizations, you may conclude that this isn't a myth at all, that it is in fact true. So you need to go a little bit deeper and you need to follow the money. Or, indeed, you could see how they responded when this committee of elected representatives told them how to address racism in the aid sector. And let's just say the jury is still out.
So to help us to dive into this topic, our guest today is the Right Honourable Sarah Champion MP. Sarah Champion is the Member of Parliament for the constituency of Rotherham in the north of England, and she is currently serving as the chair of the International Development Committee in Parliament. And this, I believe, is your second tenure as chair of the International Development Committee. Sarah, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So I'll dive into the first question. Your committee's inquiry into the racism in the aid sector was very much, I think, groundbreaking because we had never seen anything like it before. We'd previously seen inquiries that looked at disability, particularly when Penny Mordaunt was the Minister for International Development, Secretary of State for International Development. And of course, a number of inquiries had looked at, the issue of gender and how the FCDO approaches gender. But we'd never had an inquiry that looked specifically at racism. So can I just ask, why did you, as chair of the inquiry, think it was important to have this inquiry?
First of all, let me say how sad and concerning it was that it was groundbreaking rather than something which we all recognised and were trying to deal with. It was quite interesting how it came about. We were doing an inquiry into sexual abuse in the aid sector, which people seem to be more comfortable talking about. We recognise that there's an inherent power imbalance, and wherever that imbalance is, almost inevitably, unfortunately, there tends to be abuse following from that. And we had one woman, she was a witness, she was on screen. I think she was Indonesian, but she was hijab wearing. And we were talking about her experiences of sexism in the centre. And then literally as an aside, she went, and of course, that pales into insignificance compared to the racism that goes on. And it was an absolute light bulb moment for me, because I thought, wow, of course, that is going to be something that we need to be minded of and we need to be addressing. And therefore, it's something that we need to do an inquiry into because, and I felt, to be honest, quite stupid that I'd not thought about it before because it was a form of abuse that is sitting there in plain sight.
Well, please don't feel stupid, because I can say that for my experience of the development sector, it's just, we just didn't talk about it. It was just, everybody just pretended that race was not a dynamic to look at, to talk about. So the committee was not alone in not looking at it. Nobody was looking at it really, except for a few activists and a few voices who were trying to change the sector.
That's right. And so I guess what follows on naturally from there is, what did the committee learn about the state of racism in the aid sector? And as part of that, was there anything that particularly surprised you that you weren't expecting maybe to find?
Aside from the fact that it was seen as groundbreaking to be doing this, which as I've said earlier, I thought and still do think is surprising and disappointing. It was the fact that when we think about how the development sector came about, of course, it was a colonial manifestation, whether of guilt or trying to support. And so a lot of the structures, a lot of the language, a lot of the attitudes still had quite a strong colonial feel about them. There's also massive inherent power imbalance there. To take one very concrete example, the staffing structure. It tends to be that employees from overseas are paid more and have a much more generous package than the local staff. They might be doing the same jobs. So I understand that, people, if they're living away from home and they have families and they have children in school, there are additional costs associated with that. But the assumption was or is that a local person couldn't do that job. because they haven't got the skills and the expertise and the experience. And quite frankly, that's nonsense. Wherever I go in the world, there are people who are internationalists who have doing amazing jobs. So the fact that there is this assumption that local people won't be as good, for me, is a racist assumption. There's also an attitude that the people that are getting the aid, and indeed the word aid one could challenge, but I use it for shorthand, they are meant to be grateful. They're not particularly meant to have an opinion, so we don't ask them how we can best support them to achieve whatever it is they're trying to support. We instead say, here is a solution to your problem, and we've identified the problem, so it might not be your problem, but we think it is. And so now we want you to be grateful. And I'm sure all of us see examples of that. I was struck really powerfully. I was on a trip to Uganda looking at their medical systems, and specifically vaccines. And behind one of the medical facilities, there were loads, like about 10, seemingly quite new motorbikes just lying on their side. And I said, well, why are they there? And they said, oh, well, a donor from the States decided to give us 10 motorbikes so that we could travel around. But no one taught us how to service them, and we can't afford to do it. And so we just use our bicycles. And you just think, crikey, had that donor who was, very well intentioned, actually asked what was needing, then, maybe 10 bicycles would have been the solution. Maybe solar refrigeration would have been a solution. But instead, we know best. And so we give it to these poor people in these poor countries. The other thing that really frustrates me around language, and I try never to use it, is the word developing. It's like, could we possibly look at history and actually realize that everybody came from Africa? So the greatest societies have all been, I mean, look at the Syrian society, Persia. I mean, remarkable cultures, and yet we call them developing. I mean, I find that really insulting, and so the whole thing has a challenge to me. So we changed as a committee to say low income, middle income, because that's just a fact. It's not that countries are developing or underdeveloped being the implication. Um, it was also quite frustrating that a number of the recommendations that we made to FCDO, for example, that if your organisation has more than 50 staff, you ought to be doing a pay and diversity audit. That was flat rejected, and quite frustrating that it was flat rejected, not even arguing, well, maybe if the organisation was 250, because really, I think to see racism in the sector, as I said earlier, is look at what people get paid. Look at how they're valued in a very concrete way. And I think were organisations brave enough to actually publish things like that, we would start to see the problem, and therefore we'd be able to make the difference.
Yeah, that leads nicely to our next question, because the committee, unusually with this inquiry, you didn't just make recommendations to the FCDO, but also to the wider development sector. So do you have a sense of how those recommendations were received, or in fact, if it was acted upon by any of the major or even smaller organisations in the sector?
Yes, I mean, so privately, a lot of staff came to us and said, "Thank goodness you did this because it allowed us to have the conversations within our own organisations." As you said at the very beginning, it was an open secret that people knew about, but this gave them a way, in a non-confrontational way, I would assume, to discuss it. Oh, this is interesting. This committee in the UK has done this piece of work. What do we think about that? I hope that empowered people to get the change that they needed to see. But I can't give you evidence of that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that has flowed out of it, and I don't know coincidental or not, is both UNICEF and ActionAid now do publish their diversity pay differences. So that's great. It is, I would hope, less of an open secret and more an acknowledgement of something that we need to do. But really, what I hope is that the people on the ground who are impacted by this recognize that someone is listening and recognizing. And I hope that that helped.
Yeah, those are great examples to share. So I think it's fair to say that many of us, certainly myself and Lorianne included, were hopeful that the inquiry would sort of be this watershed moment that would become a catalyst for action across the sector. But it feels like it has since stalled, if we're being completely honest. So how, in your opinion, can we get that momentum back?
And maybe just for context as well, because the inquiry came around the time when there was a lot of conversation in society about racism and diversity. Today, people say DEI means die. Like the the context is so different. So yeah, how can we recapture some of that?
It was disappointing that the broader sector didn't row behind it more and see it as a watershed moment. And particularly, in our introduction, we recommend that we reference the horrific attack and murder on George Floyd, and it was, we hoped, a coming together of all of the frustrations with some practical solutions of how to make change. Um, I think from that point, the world has only got worse. I mean, what we're seeing internationally, and particularly what we're seeing in the United States and its view on diversity, is really quite chilling. And I understand that for the organisations that have had all of their funding cut, for those that are under enormous pressure not to deal with diversity or even mention it. The retrospective editing of websites that's been going on is quite dystopian, to be honest. But I understand it. I just don't agree with it. Yeah, we're in quite a dark place. So what I would say is we have a duty to the people that we're employed to serve to be better, to challenge that, even in our own small ways, even if we're in a tiny organization, if we can make incremental changes so that we respect and value everyone, both our staff and also the people that we serve, that has to make for a better world. And I think when you have so much chaos going around you internationally, it's easier to sort of retract in. But actually, this is when we need to start having those conversations and be proud about what we're doing and what we stand for. So I hope that we're at a turning point now. But it's really over to the people that are there on the front line. We've given you a tool, but it's one tiny tool, and you're not alone to try and make these changes, but we do need to change this system.
Thank you. I think, yeah, I picked up the words chilling and dystopian there, and I couldn't, unfortunately, agree more.
I know.
Absolutely, but let's not end on that note. Maybe you can tell us what else you have coming up for the committee, and if you could envisage the committee coming back to this issue again.
I won't say we're coming back to it. What we're trying to do is embed it in what we do. And that's the same. So if you watch any of our committee sessions, we always have questions around women and girls. We always have them around people with disabilities. And we always try to address racism, power imbalances, and any abuse in whatever forms that we find it. So the inquiries that we've got sort of live at the moment are one on women, peace and security. Because I don't know how we've got to a point where women, and particularly civilian women and children, are now a legitimate target in war. There are rules around warfare, and not murdering and raping women and children is pretty much up there. So having women sat around the table to broker peace, ceasefires, and prevent conflicts from happening at the start is really key for us. But unfortunately, their place at the table seems to be being taken away. So that's very disturbing to us. We're also doing a deep dive into Nigeria. A very young population, a population with huge potential, a country with huge resources, but deep inequality. Also, particularly when I think about the north of Nigeria, a country with a lot of conflict internally, but also a lot of conflict externally. And we're very keen that we do all that we can to draw attention to that so that support can be given. And then we're just about to start a deep dive into climate finance. The government is still saying it's giving £11.6 billion. Where is it going? Who is it going to? What does it mean? What is it prioritizing? There's an awful lot of questions that we're going to try and bottom out. I mean, the things for me in my inquiry is it always needs to be about empowering local people, giving them the resources, asking them what they need, and being able to create some sort of sustainable, lasting solution to the problems that they face. That is ever more important with climate finance, I would suggest. But I say this to a background of the UK is cutting its budget again by 40%. We're waiting to hear where those cuts are landing. It's cutting its staff by at least 25%. So I'm very, very concerned that the offer the UK has in a shrinking global offer to alleviate poverty is getting smaller. And so that money really, really needs to demonstrate value for money. And that's where my committee comes in to try and make sure that every taxpayer's pound is spent in the most constructive way.
Yeah, those sound like really important inquiries, and we will definitely be following along, and I hope others do as well. Before we close, is there anything else you'd want to add?
I just want to say to the development sector as a whole, don't give up hope. I know there are so many conflicts, there are so many famines, there are so many starving people, and probably underpinning all of that is so many disregarding the rule of law. And the number of humanitarian workers that were murdered last year, the number of journalists that were murdered last year, it's we're in a really bad place. And so if I can just say, make sure your governments aren't ones that collude or look away. We all need to be working to uphold international law right now, because without it, I dread to think what's going to come next. Sorry, that's not a very happy ending.
No, but an important ending and an important message for everyone. So thank you so much for joining us, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to our podcast today. We appreciate your time.
So you've heard it all before, but if you like what you heard, or at the very least are mildly intrigued, please subscribe and take a moment to rate the podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram, YouTube, all details in the description below.
You've been amazing, and we've been Take or Give.